Hi, and welcome to the review of the day, which is for the Dream Millennium by James White. And I have got this Corgi edition, Sphere Corgi, hideous condition. The cover, both on the spine and on the main cover, it looks as if it somehow got wet and the whole thing slipped sideways. There's this regrettable sticker that's also half torn off. It's just not in great condition, but it's still got a comfortable heft, a comfortable weight. It's very nice actually to read. And I picked this up basically because I loved that cover art. I think that livid blue sky, the strange sunset, are excellent. And then you've got this fight between two dinosaurs, what we once called a brontosaurus, and I think that's meant to be a raptor, I'm not sure, and a spaceship overhead. The whole thing just seemed a bit fun. Now, when I picked it up, I didn't think I knew James White at all. Now, since then, I think I've probably read a couple of his, but I don't really know who he is or what he's all about. And if I'm going to be totally honest, the reason I read this one right now is because Jake over at Pulp Mortem just read a James White. He absolutely hated it. He thought it was terrible. And I picked this up just kind of to see how good or how bad it might be. And in fact, it's really, really good. And sometimes reading a book you know nothing about with low expectations is really fun, because you can only really win at this game. If you're right and it's terrible, then you're right, which most people enjoy that. I enjoy being right. And if you're wrong and it's great, it's a wonderful surprise. And this was indeed a wonderful surprise. So I found it well written. It was published in a 1970 something or other, 1974. Copyright 1974. Sorry, this edition is 1976. The writing is a bit solid and of its day. It's got a couple of problems that I'm going to go into later. I'm going to go to great lengths to not spoiler this book, because as far as I know, no one else on YouTube has had anything to say about this one. I haven't seen a lot of reviews on Goodreads. I think there's a few, but I haven't read any of them. And honestly, from the booktubers I know who like classic SFF, science fiction fantasy, I think there's quite a few that wouldn't mind this book. There's a lot about it that's very enjoyable. So if you think you might enjoy this 1974 edition of science fiction, let me tell you a bit about what's in it, keeping it as spoiler-free as I possibly can. If anyone else has read it and would like to hear my deep dive into the spoilery things, maybe I'll do another review later on. I might even reread this one before too long, because I did really enjoy it. Okay, so we start off with our protagonist, Devlin, I think it's John Devlin, being awakening. His awakening was like waking out of a warm room and into a snowstorm. The dream, what little he could remember of it, had not been entirely pleasant, but it had been warm. And where he's waking is in a spaceship capsule, and this computer says, "Good morning, Devlin. This is a first awakening. Systems check, which will not be repeated during subsequent awakenings." And it tells him basically that the purpose of the awakening is to check his mental acuity, physically exercise his body, and remember. There's a lot of emphasis on remember. Now, from this first awakening, we're told that he'd been in stasis for 75 years, and it was a welfare check. And so we learn a little bit about the ship and a little bit about Devlin, but not a whole lot. And the awakening is fairly brief. Then he goes back into stasis. And that is half of the narrative of the book, all the way through. About 2/3, maybe 3/4 of it is Devlin going into cold stasis and then waking up. Now, with each wake up, we learn a little bit more about him, a little bit more about the ship, a little bit more about the mission. And James White feeds it to us in small drips that are continually surprising. So when he says when he talks about the training that he's had, we as experienced science fiction readers are surprised by the things that he says about it. When we hear about the human complement of the crew, we are surprised about that as well. And again, no spoilers on that one. But the ship is fully automated. For most of the time, there is no one awake. And we learn more and more about the mission over time. Eventually, we find out that the ship has been sent off from Earth. It's got at least 12 systems in a approximately linear straight line. It's going to stop at each one. The ship's going to evaluate, and if the planet has some potential to be colonized by the colonists on board the ship, it will wake up a human to confirm. But if there's issues, it'll wake up a human to make a decision. And later in this continual awakening and refreezing, what we'd call suspended animation, he's calling anesthetic sleep. And the sorts of things that a human gets awakened for, we encounter later on. One stop, there's a planet that is a huge gas giant, but one of its moons is very much in the right set of characteristics for human habitation. And then there's another where there's actually an inhabited world, not by humans. And there's this range of things. At one stage he's awakened to check on a crew member because there seems to be a physical malfunction. There's all these small things, and he'll go up to the bridge, and these small amounts of information are fed out to us at a really, really measured and really, really interesting pace. It keeps us engaged. It's not a fast-paced novel, perhaps, but the engagement is continuous and I think very well conceived. So, toward the end, these awakenings change in a whole heap of different ways. Again, no spoilers. Another character comes in. Again, no spoilers. And the end of the novel is interesting, innovative, not entirely surprising, I suspect, but it's got some quirks. So I was very satisfied with the ending. It could even leave room for another book, but I don't think it's sad if it doesn't have that. I think we can provide that from our own imaginations. Now, as we're going through these subsequent wakings and more knowledge is given to us and then sleeping again, those are alternate chapters. So the first chapter is Devlin waking up after 75 years, coming to terms with getting up and physically exercising his body, remembering, etc., etc. But the second chapter is what happens after he goes back into anesthetic sleep, suspended animation, right? And what that is, it completely wowed me. I loved every second of it. So, Devlin is in suspended animation and he is dreaming. I have a glitch with that. I think if you're in suspended animation, anesthetic sleep, whatever, sufficient to preserve your body over hundreds of years of journey, and we later learn that the proposed journey could have been much longer than it actually was. I don't think that your brain should be alert enough to be sending off the electrical impulses that require dreams. And essentially dreams are your brain firing while you are not conscious. So I had a glitch with that. I had to sort of work it around in my mind, and you accept it and move on. There's something of an explanation for that later on, no spoilers. Not sufficient to my mind, but yeah, anyway. There's a lot of explanation for it later, actually, still. Anyway. However, this dream of Devlin's, he's some tiny invertebrate scuttling on the bottom of an ocean, which he calls the Silurian Ocean, and he's trying to find something to eat. He's starving. There's all these trilobites wandering around. He sees this cephalopod, and I love that James White calls it a cephalopod. I'd say it's probably a belanite. He describes a long thin shell. feeding on trilobites, and it's this Silurian sea scene. And I was captivated and delighted and thrilled. I enjoyed every second of that. If you give me cephalopods and a Silurian sea in your second chapter, you've captured my interest. You certainly have. Anyway, I did wonder if you might be Anomalocaris, as found in the Burgess Shale, but that wasn't Silurian, wasn't it? Anyway, really enjoyed that one. And then we move into the Second Awakening. That's ship time of 282 years. And from then on, interspersed with the awakenings, and each time he awakens, something a bit different happens. A bit more is given to us, like I said. But each sleep period is different as well. So in his sleep period, this cover actually activates, and he is a dinosaur. He calls it a Brontosaurus. I think they've renamed the Brontosaurus something else. And he lives in this Jurassic, he's calling it Jurassic. I think it might be Triassic actually. But it's, anyway, he's living in this, this dinosaur swampland. Again, pretty sure these days we know that Brontosaurus didn't live in swamps, but I remember that we were taught as kids that they lived in swamps and the waters helped support all their bulk. There's a fair amount of detail that goes into this, like the hindbrain and so forth, and it's all pretty good and I enjoy it. And then he awakens again. Now, I won't say anything more about these sleep periods. He does eventually have some that are human. Why didn't I bring a drink? Sorry. He does eventually have some that are human, and as a reader you you pretty early pick up on the notion that his dreams are kind of meant to be in an evolutionary scale. And yes, and there's some explanation for that later on as well. Now, there's a lot of subtlety to this story. As well as these dreams, Devlin goes into remembering his life before he got onto the ship. And the society that we learn about through his memories is purely dystopian. We learned early on that the spaceship was aiming to escape a polluted, overcrowded world, and it sounded horrible. But his memories of it are purely dystopian. All of humanity lives in these cities, in these high-rises where thousands and thousands of people are crammed into houses that are basically the size of this library. The life they live is astronomical. There's something they called maxis. These are people who've decided that the soft approach to justice doesn't work, so they're going for a maximum violence approach. Devlin isn't a citizen. A citizen means something quite distinct, and it's never spelled out too much. But a citizen seems to mean you wear a belt and you carry weapons. And by doing so, you protect your honor a lot. Now, these sort of futuristic duels, which often occur using pistols, or I believe any other kind of weapon, are described as affairs. So if you're out and about in your armoured car, because no one can go anywhere without an armoured car, with the periscope up so you don't get shot while you're looking through the window, and you may be forced to divert because one of these affairs got bigger. It sounds like a hideous, radical, violent world, and Devlin is utterly depressed in it, which is why he takes the option of escaping on this colony ship when it's offered. Now, by about a quarter of the way, or half the way through the book, I guess, I was thoroughly invested in this backstory, and while the prime narration is Devlin waking up continually throughout this journey as it goes towards its conclusion, the actual backstory of the society was really, really good. I liked it. I like the way the society was built. I love the way that this is science fiction which really concentrated on sociology and not politics, but I guess human evolution and how a dystopian society could evolve. Now, if you like dystopian books and you're a little bit sick of every single dystopian book being a nuclear holocaust, this might well be the book for you, because in this future, it's described as a future where everyone has enough time, enough to eat, enough leisure to enjoy the many activities that are produced, but no one is happy. And this violence and unrest and truly unusual society has evolved through this overcrowding situation and pollution. We hear that even when you're outside, the air is actually less fresh than when you're inside a filtered building. The way White describes the society is exceptionally pessimistic view of society and very psychological. So you've got lots of tiny details and you've got lots of slang. He doesn't over-explain this world either. So because you get a bit of it here and then you get awakening on the spaceship, another bit here, another awakening, and sometimes another dream of a thing that isn't in his past, these three threads tie together and they build. But none of it's over-explained, and the society, especially... Actually, I've got an example from page 140 that I think gives a good example of what I'm trying to get at. So, page 140 to 141, Devlin's remembering an occasion from his life. As the ship is constantly telling him to remember his life, while he's awake, he's remembering a day that happened, and he's remembering it in some detail very, very well. So, for the first few minutes at the table, they had privacy of a sort. And the privacy of the sort is because you've got these high-rise buildings with thousands and thousands of cubicles in them, and a recreation room where most people go for recreation because there isn't a lot of safety outside. There's three people sitting at the table. There's the brother, there's Devlin, and there's a young woman. The brother's profession was obvious from his dress, and Devlin's from the ornate dress earring which he wore on semi-social occasions, both of which indicating that they're not citizens, they're not wearing belts, and they're not on the market for shoot-ups. Nevertheless, a crowd of high-spirited but essentially good youngsters. That was how the block sociologist described them, but nobody else described them that way. They seemed intent on harassing these two half-sheep who had the temerity to sit with one of the best-looking girls in the building. Now, later on, they go up onto the roof where they've got a little bit more privacy, and they sit there and they're talking for a while. They found a radiant plate which sheltered them from the wind and gave a good view of the city. Occasionally a security man came along to check on the plate's functioning in case they had been irresponsible enough to damage it or switch it off. They did not mind that because the plates were not there for the convenience of block dwellers on cold nights, but as infrared dazzlers against high-spirited but essentially good types in other blocks who wanted to shoot at roof security men with heat-sighted or heat-seeking weapons. So that's a little snippet from this book, and one of the ways in which White is constantly building the society. And it's very elaborate, and I enjoyed it a great deal. So yes, exceptionally pessimistic view of where society is going, but an exceptionally odd and interesting way of getting out of it. So they do mention generation spaceships at one stage. Apparently this society, while extremely futuristic and forward, and the science is meant to be so great, they tell us that a number of times. From a 2024 perspective, it doesn't sound like their science is that great, but for 74, yeah, sure. Okay, they talk about generation ship, but they didn't have the science for that. They only had science for a fully automated ship where everyone was in suspended animation or anesthetic sleep. Great premise, and in general it's a good book. Now, for the modern reader, there may be a couple of quirks. Women exist in one of those classic SF bubbles. They're there, but they're somehow not the same as men. Early on in the book, there's this sequence where Devlin, as the voice of James White, is talking to some other guy about whether women should or should not be allowed to wear belts, should or should not be allowed to fight for their own honour, or whether a man had to have a belt and fight for her honour for her. It was really, really ambiguous. I read most of it twice and I still can't decide if it was meant to be, yes, women can be citizens and have their own belt, or no, women shouldn't be citizens and should be fought for by men. I've got no real idea what he was trying to get at there, and I'm not reading it a third time to find out. Whichever it was, the tone is dodgy, whichever one he's arguing for, and certainly none of the, I think, 2 women that appear in this book are citizens, per se and as such. It doesn't sound like a good atmosphere for women, or for girl children in general, as White states later. So aside from that patriarchal element that is something that a lot of 70s SF, classic SF has, we do have a female secondary character and she's quite active towards the end. It can be a little bit on the nose, I guess, but if you like reading classic science fiction, I don't think it'll be a problem for you. There was one incident that really shocked me a little bit at how brutal it was. Much later in the book, we have a comment that makes it seem that James White was distinctly and acutely homophobic. It's a brief mention, but essentially he doesn't seem to be, in context, he doesn't seem to be differentiating between homosexuality, people who have those sorts of relations with children, and people who engage in heavy sadism. I hope that, for personal gratification, I hope that YouTube doesn't censor any of that. It's very brief, but be warned, it's a little bit in your face. Other than that, I think this book has aged quite well. Certainly the narrative has. Right up to the end, where we start getting a lot of exposition. No, it's not like this exposition is. It's at the end. A lot of explanation, a lot of the background science, a lot of the reasons behind things that have been happening that were odd. Because, like many science fiction books that have a spaceship going somewhere, there's a mystery inherent in this, which you learn slowly through the exposition of Devlin waking up, his backward thoughts, his increasing concern over the dreams that he's getting. So, there's a lot to this book. I hope I have sparked some people's interest. Don't sweat the nasty bit. It's pretty small, it's one paragraph, it just is a bit shocking, so bear that in mind. And I would love to hear what other people have thought of this book, if anyone's actually read it. I can't find anyone else who's read it. It's certainly worth reading. Among 1970s classic SF, I think this one probably deserves a bit more attention than it's getting, and I will probably be looking out for more James White, purely based on this. Thank you for watching. Read good books. Tell me about this book if you have thoughts and feelings. Bye.